This is Andrew Noose, and this is the Ansville Gatehouse, Chapter 5, Monsters and Angels. Daren hit the bottom of the metal shaft, but instead of smashing his injured leg, rolled into a ball and let gravity take him down the slightly curved ventilation shaft. From above, Alicia's boots spread out and gripped the sides of the wall, but not hard enough. Losing her footing, she spun out and fell hard into Daren's chest. He groaned loud even as Alicia's body lay against him. He could feel the heat radiate from her, and for a second, the thought of her against him wasn't so bad. In fact, it was exhilarating. Alicia leaped to her feet before kneeling next to him. Her mouth was so close to his own as she stared worriedly at him. "Are you okay?" "I tried stopping, but I'm good," Daren whispered in a groan. He turned and tried to get his footing when Alicia's hand was in front of his. She pulled him to his shaking feet, and for a moment, all he could do was cough and take in several breaths of air. With a flick of her hand, a blue-white light orb hovered, illuminating the metal shaft they were in. Tapping the metal sides a few times, she took a few steps back before, with a strained yell, spun about and kicked with the force of a horse. The interior of the shaft echoed with her cry in shocking power. Another kick sent a portion of the metal siding to break free, leaving a small gap in the wall. Getting to her knees, she peered into the darkness on the other side. "It's dark, but I think we have more room to walk in here." She crawled through the opening and, once on the other side, took hold of Daren's arm, helping him through. Standing to his feet, he gazed around him in the light Alicia's light orb cast. They were on a metal catwalk overlooking hundreds of gears, pipes and gauges. Steam poured out of relief valves everywhere they turned. Alicia looked back at the opening to the shaft. "They'll be here in minutes, if not less." She spotted some stairs leading down to a more open space. "Let's go." Leaning on Alicia for support, Daren descended, grimacing at the pain. Once on level ground again, he looked about him, feeling an unease grow. The chamber they were in was part of the foundation of an island with enormous gears and pumps. A giant burner was placed in the center, giving off a neon blue flame that pulsed through translucent pipes. A large mixing container was set in the middle of the room with a large plated window. The glowing mixture of the immediately recognizable oil and something else exited into other pipes that then spread out into other areas of the island. From above, the humming of drones were heard. "This way." Alicia pulled Daren along, ignoring his sharp breathing. "I saw an opening at the far wall. I think if we can crawl through, the drones will be able to follow." Above, the hum grew loud, and with it, a blinding light shone down. He swung around and fired off several charges. Each charge hit its target as drones veered off hard to explode into walls or pipes. 4 more came in their stead and descended rapidly towards him. Alicia was running in front of him, taking care not to get too far ahead. Strange clicking sound made him glance behind. 2 drones were carrying something in retractable claws. They sped past other drones till they were near enough. He clearly saw glowing numbers ticking backwards. Swearing under his breath, he said, "Alicia." "Bomb." He dove to the side even as the drones dropped their load. The nearby wall and pipes exploded with screeching metal and brick fragments flying everywhere. Daren rolled underneath a work table and covered his face with his arms. He felt the heat of the blast brush by and small fragments whiz by his head. Lifting his head slightly, he peered out to watch Alicia's hands lift. Her eyes were narrowed and the air felt charged. A sudden crackle of energy shook everything about him as white light cracked and spun. She swung her hand out, and the white ball of energy grew in mass even as it sped outwards in blinding speed. The 2 bomber drones burst into flame even as another wave of fire shot out, hitting 4 more drones. Alarms went off with high-pitched shrieks. With no other warning, 2 projectiles shot through the chamber from a different direction. Daren yelled, "Behind you." Alicia spun, hands waving with white fire dripping down her arms. Her face was a mask of concentration. She swung out with both hands, and a streak of fire, fast as lightning, struck the 2 projectiles. The entire chamber groaned and shook. An orange glow exploded, ripping apart pipes and gears. Steam screamed through broken valves, casting the chamber in a white cloud of smoke and vapor, fires burning everywhere. Daren leaped to his feet, and with adrenaline pulsing in his veins, reached Alicia's side. She pointed to a gap underneath large pipes fastened to the nearby wall. "You first!" She turned and let out another stream of withering, crackling fire at more fast-approaching drones. Getting to his knees, he crawled as fast as possible underneath the pipes. Once on the other side, he stood up and saw he was next to a corridor leading to an exit. Turning, he said, "I see an exit. Get over here." Alicia let loose 2 more blasts of energy to spread outward before dropping to her knees. 6 drones suddenly appeared at the far end of the chamber. As one, they aimed and fired a volley of projectiles. Daren's eyes grew wide in shock as his heart leaped into his throat. "Shield! Shield yourself!" Alicia's shield rose just as the first of a barrage of attacks hit. She was flung backwards hard against steel pipe as it exploded with a screeching groan. Steam blasted out everywhere with a violent shake of the entire chamber. She fell hard to the ground and didn't get back up. "Crawl!" Daren screamed. He could hardly see her through the smoke and steam. His heart raced hard. When she didn't respond, he pushed through the twisted metal pipes as drones hammered Alicia's flickering shield. He grabbed hold of her arm with one hand, the other gripping the side of a pipe with his bad leg leveraging. Ignoring the scream of pain shooting up his leg, he pulled and groaned, till we're on the other side of the pipes again. On his feet, he pulled Alicia up and flung her over his shoulder like a bag. Groaning, he ignored his bad leg and forced himself to move down the corridor. When at the door, he cast one look back and saw the pipes explode. Swearing, he opened the door to a brick alleyway. Hurrying, he carried Alicia through the narrow opening of 2 buildings with domed roofs. Then it was down another alley for good measure. He knew it wouldn't take long for the drones to find him. He raced down the road, forgetting that he had an injured leg. He carried Alicia in a firm grip, single-minded. He had only one thing on his mind. He had to find a hiding place, not for him, but Alicia. Rounding another corner, a door came into view with a window next to it. Letting Alicia down gently, he peered into the window to see an open room and hallway. It seemed to have been abandoned for a while now. Reaching for the doorknob, he wiggled it a bit, already knowing it was locked. Fumbling his pockets, he pulled out a worn set of picks he always carried with him. The old city was a mass of old buildings and not all were explored. Fiddling with the locking mechanism of the door for a few seconds, and the audible click was heard. Pulling Alicia up again, he opened the door and let himself in. The interior of the building was spacious with a couch to one side facing a fireplace with clocks and maps hanging on the wall. A kitchen area was off to one side and a hall led down to other rooms. Kicking the door shut behind him, he looked for the curtains. Letting Alicia down once more, he pulled the curtains shut before picking her up again. Walking slowly now, he made his way through the hallway to a bedroom. There, he let Alicia slide onto the bed where he tucked blankets around her. All this done, he went back to the living room with gun in hand and sat waiting. His insides were a jumble of emotions. They had just left a place that could at any moment send the entire island into a ball of flames to fall from the sky to everyone's death. A soft hum sent him into alertness. Clutching the gun tight, he knew he was no match. Sweat trickled down his neck as his nerves screamed. His heart beat hard and fast, and all he could think was Alicia, laying in bed helpless. His thoughts hardened into resolve, eyes narrowing. Whatever she had been, she wanted nothing to do with that life. She was in his eyes innocent. And that, more than anything else, burned a fire inside. Maybe it was his imagination playing tricks on him. He swore he could suddenly hear clearer. The humming of each 6 drones outside became distinct. The light dripping of a faucet echoed in his ears. And one more sound solidified and drowned out all others. A heartbeat thudded softly from behind him in a bed. Strange as it was, he knew if he wanted to, he could aim right now and destroy at least 5 of the 6 drones easy. The confidence came as a shock, even as his mind said the truth of it all. He waited. The humming outside grew and grew. And just as it was the loudest, the humming diminished till all was quiet except a drip, drip, thump, 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 thump. And in that moment, Daren realized a strange thing. He could listen to that heartbeat in contentment. Alicia's eyes flickered open to a stream of sunlight filtering through half-drawn curtains. Blinking back sudden aches in her back, she let her eyes focus and scan her surroundings without opening her eyelids. It was a technique she was taught to evade notice that she was awake. She was in a bedroom of some kind. From the window and sunlight, she was somewhere on New Muskegon, not down below again. But other than that, she didn't know. Opening her eyes slowly, she noted also that Daren was missing. A tinge of pain pricked at the thought. Dismissing it quickly, she turned and saw a large-sized wardrobe. Lifting herself up, she felt jolts of pain shoot through her body. She gasped softly, holding her stomach, and bent over slightly. She grimaced and slowed her pace of movement till at last she stood to her feet. Finding slippers nearby, she slipped her cold feet into them before making her way to the wardrobe. It opened to a wide variety of dresses, strange pattern designs that weren't exactly vibrant colors, but more pale, with a uniform design fit for a military outing. She ignored them completely and went to the section that held a general style of pants suitable for working in. It was obvious this person had gotten dirty working on some engine. There were a few stains that a wash had missed. She absently wondered who was her host. Sniffing her clothes, her heart skipped a beat. She had to take a bath. She couldn't be walking around if Daren was still here. The thought sent a shiver up her spine, and she glared at the intrusive feeling. She grabbed the pair of pants and a matching shirt with a jacket before looking about the room. Spotting a rather large bathroom, she immediately made her way there before stripping and finding running hot water. She didn't care that she knew nothing about her host. That would wait until she didn't smell like dirty clothes. Half an hour later, she emerged from the bathroom in a tan brown pair of pants, a white ruffled sleeve shirt under a dark leather jacket. The clothes fit well enough and fit her style. Walking slowly as not to disturb whoever was her host, Alicia smelled something sweet in the air. It made her stomach rumble fierce, and she realized just how long she had gone without food. Reaching the kitchen area, a smile slowly formed and her heart warmed considerably. Daren stood over a wood-burning stove, the slight smell of ash in the air. He was stirring a pot dressed in leathers like herself, but in a black vest, high-top boots, and a blue V-neck shirt. He wasn't hobbling on his feet either, something she already knew would be the case. Knowing a thing or two about his family legacy, she knew they healed quickly like herself. She stared at him longer than intended. Her heart quickened a little before she took a long breath. Stepping the rest of the way into the kitchen, she sat at a bar separating the kitchen from the living room. Again, she caught herself staring at Daren, and it angered her. Her feelings were strange this morning, inflicting years of steel resolve and a single day's event. And here she was unguarded, feelings swaying so freely it made her almost sick. Without turning, Daren said casually, "You've been asleep for at least a whole day and night." "What?" She blinked in surprise. "Why did you let me?" She paused, realizing she was missing something. She looked about the place before back at Daren. "How did we get here?" He shrugged. "I carried you." "How else?" "You were knocked completely unconscious. I wasn't about to let the drones kill you. So I carried you out of the engine room, into the alleys, and found a nice vacant home to lay low in for a few days." The whole time he said this, he kept stirring the pot as if it were some natural thing he did. He mentioned nothing about his foot or how it had healed so fast. He was probably avoiding the conversation out of need. He was clearly not ready for that conversation. Every minute, every hour she was around this man, Alicia realized he was different than anyone else she had ever been around. She had to pause that train of thought. He hadn't been around most anyone. But even in towns when she was on the run all these years, people didn't just drop what they were doing and risk their life for her. That wasn't normal. Daren wasn't normal. He could have easily ran when she got struck in the engine room. He had no obligation at all to her. Why did he do this? Thoughts sent waves of weird sensations she had no words for. She even felt the breaking of long-dormant dams begin to crack. Anger at losing so much control swept up, and in a furious glare, stormed out of the kitchen, her entire body shaking hard. She couldn't do this. What in the world was happening? She half walked, half ran back to her bedroom and crawled into bed, tears suddenly spilling down her face. She would never let anyone see her cry. It was a sign of weakness. She couldn't ever let Daren see her this way. For the next few minutes, she fought to compose herself, all the while feeling she didn't even know who she was anymore. She had been on the run for so long, it's all she really knew. One sign of kindness, no, not just that. One sign of human decency, and she melted. What a weak fool. A knock came, and before she could reply, Daren came into the room with an expression saying he didn't care if she wanted him there or not. He held a tray in hand with a steaming bowl of stew and bread on the side. Closing her eyes briefly, she forced resolve into place and sat up to receive whatever it was Daren had made. Her stomach said it didn't care. It smelled food and was starving. When all was settled, he grabbed a nearby chair and sat next to her. "Quiet, my heart," she whispered internally. "Men are what made you." But Daren wasn't those men. She sipped at the bowl of soup with a spoon, realizing another shocking truth. She wasn't always watching her surroundings. Any time she had eaten in the past, she always watched the crowds. Nobody was safe to be around. Everybody was out for something. But Daren, his presence and sudden stance made it crystal clear it wasn't about him, but her care. He was doing everything for her good. Lowering the spoon from her mouth, she said in a choked whisper, "Why? Why are you helping me like this? You said you wanted me gone." Daren let a sliver of a smile form. "It is who I am. I told you this." Alicia frowned, shaking her head. "It's not normal. Look around you, Daren. Look where you were just a few days ago. People don't simply help others out, not in this age." "I do." Daren smiled and turned to look out the window. His expression turned down into a frown and the strange light in his eyes dimmed. A thought suddenly occurred to her. Puzzled, she asked, "Where did you get this stuff?" Daren pointed out the window, a frown still on his face. "I know how to not be seen if I don't want to be." She nodded and chewed on the soft potatoes and vegetables. It was like eating a kingly dinner right then. When finished with the meal, she turned to look at Daren, something in his expression worrisome. "What is it? Why do you look like that?" For a long while Daren didn't say anything. When he did, though, it was in a soft, forlorn voice with sadness. "When I was out foraging for something we could eat," his expression turned dark, "I found myself staring at a people I don't know, and don't care to. I thought there were two classes here, the wealthy who lived here and those of us who had nothing." He sighed and said, "I now wonder if we underneath may be more free than those up here." She frowned, not sure what Daren was getting at. "I'm confused." "Slaves, Alicia." Daren looked at her with little emotion. "This whole city is built on the system of trading and selling of slaves." He grimaced with his next words. "I saw the market and know what the purpose is here. It's not the building of ships and prototypes, though that is part of the appeal." He shook his head with a deep sigh. "The main income comes from over there." He pointed in a north direction. "In ages past, I read in some historical books, there was a thing called a Colosseum. It was a brutal form of entertainment that the audience loved. They craved for blood and death, so gladiators, slaves, would fight to the death for the enjoyment of the mob. And that's here?" Daren nodded slowly. "What little I've seen, and I've only seen it briefly once before, brutality is next level here. There's no end of blood. This city is evil on a level I never thought possible." Alicia closed her eyes, feeling a tremor escape. From a pocket, Daren produced a piece of paper. "There are posters everywhere, telling everyone that temple is at noon. All are to attend and pray to the patron god." He handed her the paper and she took it in hand. As the image on the paper unfolded, the form of a striking sword appeared. Engraved runes marked the blade with an open eye staring from the cross hilt. Immediately, waves of nausea and panic swept through her, with terror threatening to succumb her. Thrusting the paper aside, like a poisonous snake, she backed up against the headboard, her heart pounding in her chest. Flashes of images she had tried to forget surfaced. Blood, her blood in a ritual. She lay atop the altar of her family's temple room, high above the rest of the palace. Naked to the world, she waited as was told. The ceremonial ritual was taken from that of thousands of years ago, in what scholars had called a ziggurat temple ceremony, an echo of Gog's bed. It was the height of blasphemy, an abomination on a cosmic scale. And she was the sacrifice, the host, the child bride. As images flashed by, her hands clenched tightly together. She heard Daren yelling, but part of her had crawled back into hiding. His voice was a thin echo far away. She only briefly registered her hands bleeding from piercing fingernails into her palms. She was a child again, in a nightmare that never ended. Phantom pain throughout her body surfaced, reminding her of horrendous nights, the brutal torture of her mind and body. He was here. The devil was here, and she would never escape his gaze. Daren's hairs stood on end. Picking up the poster Alicia let drop, he eyed it over, unfused. The look in her eyes said enough and sent chills into him he had no name for. Whatever it was the poster represented, it had terrified her. And she wasn't easily scared. Not till now. It was settled. He didn't care the risk. Getting to his feet, he said, "We're going with my original plan. We hijack an airship and get the heck out of this cesspool." He reached in a back pocket and withdrew another piece of paper before flattening it out on his lap. The paper was a large map that seemed to have been taken from a signpost. It marked all the major spots of the city and the many island transport areas to get from one place to the next. "So we're here." Daren tapped a dot near the center of the map. We're close to major attractions, so there will be a lot of people to mingle in among. He slid his finger a little to the left. This is Docking B. The airships are more private party owned, more easily accessible. Alicia nodded, but her whole personality had died. Instead, a shell of a person nodded. A need in him came over echoes of watching his parents early on. Reaching over, he took her hands in his and looked into her vacant eyes. Whatever it is you went through is in the past, Alicia. You're here. Soon, everything will be behind you as you float on the clouds with not a care in the world. He squeezed her fingers gently and softly said, I would take whatever pain you faced if I could, but I can't. But I do know something and can empathize some. In a softer voice, flowing from his heart, he said, You are not what others make you. You are unique and beautiful. A flicker of eye movement, and she shook her head stiffly. I'm not beautiful. You don't know who I am, what I've done. With eyes cast down, she whispered in a forlorn whisper, I deserve this. Daren glared, feeling something inside burn. I watched you as you held that poster. I saw that expression. If I had to guess, you were tortured. Nobody deserves that. Alicia glared back, but in the saddest, remorseful look he had ever seen on a person. I do. She got to her feet and made her way into the living room. 2 bags sat near the front door. I took the liberty of packing a few things for us, essentials and what not, a change of clothes, some food items. Daren opened one of the bags for Alicia to inspect. He pulled out 2 knives, of which one he tucked into his belt. One way or another, we're getting out of you and me. He looked about the place. I don't think I can stomach another second in this city. Alicia picked up her bag and swung it about her shoulder like a backpack. Reaching the door, she opened it slightly and peered out. She nodded once, and the 2 of them made their way into the streets. They hadn't noticed it the first time they had climbed the stairs from the train station, but now it was prevalent everywhere. The smell. It was a sweet, pungent odor mixed with sweat and metallic. Overhead, buildings towered in odd shapes, fashioned out of fairly new material that easily bent. The straight towering buildings would meet curved metal frames to give the appearance of oddly designed frames. Domed roofs, curving walls that slanted up and down, the entire structure of New Muskegon was a dizzying array of convoluted architectural designs. And somehow, it all fit together as islands moved, passed by each other and held together via linking bridges and stairs. Streets were filled with a variety of goods, while on almost every corner street were stages next to housings with caged rooms. On the platform for bidding audiences, washed but thinly dressed slaves in chains stood with numbers branded into their forearms. The auctioneer read off in a loud voice each number while a guard prodded the slave to turn. Each in turn would be undressed for the buyer to see what kind of blemishes or disfigurement would bring the price down. Alicia's eyes were focused ahead, cold and detached. Daren had a feeling if she looked sideways, there would be blood spilling the streets. After leaving a marketplace filled with vegetables, the street opened onto a broader market they couldn't avoid. There were more slaves here, but not 1 or 2. This was an auctioning market with several booths and stages. Men dressed in much richer clothes than seen before stood there, bidding with friends and colleagues. The slaves were also different here. They were more muscular, some with deep scars. Security as well was tight with guards lining the walls. In the distance was a large stone arch that led out from the market into a wealth of doors and corridors. In the distance could be heard shouting and cheering. We begin our bidding with number 2533, a fine specimen of a warrior queen, the auctioneer to the left drawled with emphasis. She is a Tier 3 fighter whose legendary feats are renowned in many sky cities. We only provide the best entertainment here in New Muskegon. Recently winning the district championship, her kill count has surpassed 100. The audience whispered their appreciation and respect. Daren glanced briefly at the woman out of curiosity. Her muscle tone was that of hardened steel. Her eyes, though, were ice cold, wrists locked in heavy chains as well as her ankles. She wore very little, showing off scar after scar inflicted with brutal cuts. She looked absolutely fierce. In contrast, the men who ogled her feminine form were practically drooling over her like a trophy they had to have at all cost. Someone shouted, "Is she a virgin?" The crowd laughed raucously with many lewd remarks. It was quickly decided she was, because nobody would be stupid enough to get near her in bed. The crowd roared laughter even more and the auction continued. Stage after stage was the same, filled with hungry eyes and not a care for decency. In every human eyes on stage was death, as there was no spark of life in them. The women and children were the most favored and crowded. Each was eyed and made to undress like animals being looked over for blemishes. Nothing was taboo as the deeper Daren and Alicia walked the streets, the more depraved the populace got. At one point Alicia stopped, her entire body rigid, hands formed into fists so tight her palms began bleeding again. How much further to the docks? A few more blocks and we'll be at the warehouse district where there's a docking station. We're almost free. Alicia nodded and they walked on. The market had grown quieter here and only a few people loitered near old stores. The lighting wasn't as great either, but the first of many airships were spotted high above. Rounding the next corner as per the instructions on the map, they found themselves in a dark alley. Daren swore under his breath and looked about him. This can't be right. The map shows the docks nearby. Maybe we took a wrong turn. He shook his head. The map points here. Alicia suddenly gave a sharp intake of breath, hissing between her teeth. She instinctively reached out with her power in front of her. Looking up, Daren scanned his surroundings. On a wall nearby, glowing in strange blue light, the image of the sword in the poster stood out. Just staring at the image had a strange effect on him. He felt as though his movements were quickly becoming numbed. What the heck? He growled and looked over to see Alicia's face turn pale. Her eyes grew in terror. Through a soft whimper, she whispered, "No, no, no." She slowly turned, and he heard sounds coming towards them. A clicking sound echoed in an otherwise deafening silence, followed by a slow, steady hiss. A figure emerged from the darkness of the alley, the outline of tattered clothes. Coming nearer, the figure looked almost skeletal, a gray skin hung on outlined bones. For a head, only wisps of hair hung over a skeletal face that looked to have been glued on, otherwise being melted off. Large holes dug in for eyes above a thin, pointed nose. Alicia flung up her hands before panic set in. He looked briefly at Daren, and he knew they were in danger. He sluggishly drew out his charge gun and aimed at the deformed figure. "Who? What is it?" His voice betrayed the sinking cold feeling in the pit of his stomach. "Something that doesn't belong here," Alicia whispered back in the same chilled voice. He glared. "Can we kill this thing?" She shook her head slowly. "It's already dead." In a slow, deliberate coldness, she added, "Its master is here with us." A cold laugh echoed from the shadows. "Ah, the princess knows what has awakened." Stepping out of the shadows behind the skeletal creature, a man dressed in long black robes smiled coldly. Long white hair flowed down his back to match his white ghost-like face. The doublet underneath his overcoat was richly decorated in blue over a white finely knit tunic. His eyes glowed in the dimly lit alley, and in his hand, he held a sword. It was the sword that captured Daren's attention. It glowed an off-red hue and radiated something that made his stomach want to heave. There was a wrongness to the very thing. It didn't belong here. It was a tangible evil. The alley suddenly began to melt and he blinked several times. All about him, a glowing red cracked through layers of stone bricks like blood oozing out of a wound. The ooze dripped and sizzled on the ground like acid. And in a matter of seconds, all became singular focused, all other things dark. Ah, the point when humans suddenly realized their place in the world. The man stared hard into Daren's eyes with a sinister smile. He sounded as though he wasn't really there, but all the senses screamed he was. The swordsman's eyes turned slowly to fixate on Alicia, and she visibly cowered, her expression turning to a horrific scream. She closed her eyes tight and visibly shook. The swordsman reached out a hand, and razor-sharp claws extended before he caressed Alicia's face intimately. In a whisper meant for Daren to hear, the man said, "We meet again, love, my bride." Alicia jerked back as though she had touched fire, her entire expression one of absolute fear. But like himself, she seemed to be frozen in place. The man drew her near with his clawed fingers and sniffed her hair, his face inches from her own. He slowly and deliberately touched her head, caressing her till lowering to her neck and back. Tears spilled down Alicia's face, her mouth open in a silent scream. The swordsman gave a soft chuckle and trailed his clawed fingers across and down the front of her, stopping to grope one of her breasts in a tight squeeze. She flinched with tears streaming down her face. With a long sigh, the swordsman gave a hard shove and she stumbled and fell hard to the ground where she lay shaking. What a pitiful waste! The swordsman glared and spit at Alicia. "You were someone special. I made you into something to behold. You were the queen of blood, I bride of flesh to delight my senses, to stop the madness of looking on you parasites of human meat. I loathe your smell, your very existence. This world belongs to those like me. You He kicked Alicia in the stomach, rolling her onto her back where he then pressed his foot onto her throat. "You are nothing. Nothing without me. Remember your place!" Daren screamed and sighed, feeling flames burning from something he couldn't identify. But the hotter it burned, the invisible binding around him slowly slackened. In a desperate scream, he shouted, "Leave her alone!" The swordsman spun lightning fast and grabbed him by his throat, lifting him into the air with inhuman strength. With violence and inhuman eyes, he flew through the air and hit the nearby brick wall in blinding pain. He felt black spots appear in his vision and he felt like throwing up. Fighting everything in himself, he struggled to his knees. The swordsman returned to Alicia, a single glare directed at Daren. Now, where was I before being rudely interrupted by a gnat? He flicked a wrist and a gag appeared around her mouth. Another appeared around her wrists. In a tone that sounded only half remorseful, the man said, "I had hoped to find you before your father's henchmen found you first. We could have made plans, you back in my arms, back where you belong, filling your belly with my seed, my creations." He gave a wicked smile. "I guess I'll settle with what comes next. Blood is blood and I want to see humans kill." He yanked her up by the hair and dragged her to her feet. Spinning to where the skeletal figure stood nearby, he said, "Get that dead weight up. I think he may have feelings for my wife. We can't let him be disappointed in her final act." The skeletal figure shoved a knife hard against Daren's back and gave off a hiss. It couldn't speak since there was no tongue but prodded till he was on his feet again. He wavered a little, but was otherwise coming to. He watched Alicia ahead of him, her head downcast in a defeated stance. It was so unlike her, not even trying to fight her captor. Ahead and to the right, a flight of stairs ascended somewhere. The swordsman stopped and peered at Alicia with cold, detached eyes. "Now, my princess." He stretched out a gray hand and stroked her hair, causing her to flinch violently. His eyes burned at her movement and grabbed a fistful of hair, pulling hard till she was staring at him. With a cold smile, he said, "Today, I will see you judged for your crimes." He turned to Daren and glared. "You boy have befriended this traitor, this whore." He turned back to Alicia with a broad smile. "Isn't that right, Alicia? A whore for your daddy, for everyone in your family. And for me, your lover, your master, your god." Daren watched Alicia's whole demeanor change in an instant. She still had at least some spark in her right up till she heard him speak. Her eyes fell and the spark inside her died out. "Alicia." Daren turned to glare at the man. "Don't listen to." A backhanded swing landed on his cheek with a loud crack, and his head snapped to the side violently with blinding pain. He screamed as white spots flashed before his eyes. "You only speak when I tell you to." The swordsman's eyes bore into him with hate. His hand came up again in a fist. "Understand me?" Daren blinked back watering eyes and slowly nodded. The swordsman gave a shallow smile. "Shall we proceed?" He waved to the skeletal figure, and they ascended the stairs. Daren found his feet move involuntarily and it unnerved him. He closed his eyes briefly, trying to calm himself. Everything was spiraling out of control. He racked his brain, trying to come up with a solution, an escape plan, anything to stall whatever lay at the top of the stairs. But nothing came to mind. He glanced at Alicia. Her downward gaze hadn't shifted. It was as if the swordsman knew just how to control her. He had stopped fighting altogether with only a single tear from her eye. Climbing the stairs a step at a time, he feinted a stumble. Immediately, a sharp knife stuck at his back and he staggered to his feet again. Reaching the top of the stairs, they were in a long corridor with iron bars to each side. A loudspeaker was broadcasting something. "The leading contender, Snake Blood, has won his victory today." Muffled cheers rang out from above. When the crowd silenced again, the voice continued, but most of what was said couldn't be overheard. Softer cheers. Then in a somewhat louder voice, "Shall be tried for crimes against the ruling law, against the high temple, scorning devotion and prayer, and against her family, a benefactor and high lord of these lands." Reaching two double doors, they slowly opened to an evening sky above. All about them there were high stone walls encircling a sandy grave where blood stained the ground with mangled parts of the human body with flies buzzing everywhere. Directly in the center, a large wooden stage stood with pillars. A table was set to the side with an assortment of used torture devices. 2 ropes were tied to hooks on each end of the pillars, which itself was stained in several spots. Forcibly marched to the stage, Daren heard the echoing cry of cheering coming from seats of spectators above the circling wall. He glanced briefly into the crowd and saw nothing but death. Their expressions screamed for blood, lusted for his death while knowing nothing about him. All they cared to see was an execution. He turned back to the stage, reliving the last moments of his parents. They had died similarly, but in the streets, himself being forced to watch as one by one, a dull blade was used to saw the necks open, their dying screams, and the hand over him, holding his eyes open forcibly to watch their life slowly drain from a long and agonizing ordeal. His insides twisted. Was this it? Was he about to face the same fate as his parents? From above, drones hovered with lenses, broadcasting everything. At the foot of the stage, the swordsman dragged Alicia by the hair up the steps with the skeletal figure prodding him with the tip of a knife to follow. From high above, something glowing descended. That same sickness from being near the man's sword increased. Hovering just out of reach, from inside a cloud of vaporous gas, something resembling an eye floated. Complete with veins and tentacles, it blinked and looked on. The swordsman nodded briefly and gave a chilling smile to Alicia. Now all are in attendance. Your family will watch as your punishment is carried out. At a beckoning of a hand, a large man in black garb with muscles stepped onto the platform. He looked towards the glowing eye and nodded slowly. In the eyes of all who matter, I declare you, Alicia Alcaran, guilty of betrayal to your family's legacy. You have broken the laws of the 9 gods in New Muskegon. You have broken vows of the greatest importance, of the Order of the Temple, and her given orders to appease the gods. At this time, the 3 mercenaries who had been hunting Alicia stepped onto the platform. Each wore a menacing glare towards her coupled with a devilish smirk. Who are the witnesses? The swordsman called out. We are. The 3 mercenaries replied in unison. Grabbing Alicia by the hair again, the swordsman dragged her to the middle of the platform where everyone could watch clearly. The swordsman turned to Daren and snarled, You will watch what your failed attempt at rescuing her has brought. He turned and reaching into his pockets, drew out a piece of paper he handed to the muscular guardsman. The guardsman held up the paper for a second, cleared his throat and said, Alicia Alcaran, your crimes and punishment is as follows. For killing several of our peace officers in cold blood, the punishment is death. You have destroyed and endangered the citizens of New Muskegon. The punishment for this is severe whipping before your death is carried out. He paused and frowned in confusion. With a shrug, he read on. It is also for high treason and the breaking of your vows to a high temple priest, inciting adultery and advances that have caused unrest. You are to be stripped and whipped until you breathe your last breath. He let the paper fall and said loudly, Let this be a reminder to everyone. The laws of the 9 are here to protect us. Let this fugitive serve as a reminder not to disobey the ruling order of the temple and the gods. He turned and nodded to the mercenaries. Each wore a chilling grin as 2 grabbed ropes lying on the ground with manacles. These, they clamped onto Alicia's wrists. The 3rd mercenary went to a lever at the side of the stage and cranked it, tightening the ropes till Alicia's arms were outstretched in taunt. Gathering around her again, the 3 men turned wicked grins on her, fully enjoying themselves at the moment. A knife flashed in one of the men's hands. With violent tugs, they tore at her clothes like wolves. Daren heard Alicia's gasping sobs pierce parts of him he thought had died ages ago. At last, the 3 mercenaries stepped away with satisfying looks on their faces. She hung by the ropes, tears streaming down her face, naked for everyone to see. The guard walked in front of her, and with a violent yank, tore the gag from her mouth. She glared at the guard in hate, and spit at him, catching him on the side of his face. The guard turned glowering eyes at her, wiped the spit from himself, and punched her hard in the stomach. She moaned but refused to cry. Her hatred burned now. The guard gave a gruff laugh followed by that of the crowd. His eyes lingered on her breasts before walking to the table. Grabbing what he needed, he let a long leather whip dangle to the floor. On the whip's tail were metal spikes. Daren looked down, not bearing to watch what was about to happen. A gray hand clenched around his throat and lifted his head again. In a cold voice, the swordsman whispered, You will watch, boy. You will watch and listen to her screams of death. Daren bit his lip and looked on. He saw Alicia's legs trembling, her eyes locked onto something far away. And then he saw them. Healed now, they were still visible as white lines across her abdomen, her legs, breasts, every part of her. She had been whipped before, but not just once. Her whole body bore scars of brutal savagery over a long period of time. Suddenly, things clicked. Her guardedness with him, her stubborn nature. He had been horribly abused and now, she was going to die in the same fashion. The guard lifted the whip high, dangling the tail mid-thigh. Swinging back, he lunged. It cracked loud, and Alicia let out a deafening scream. Blood splashed the floorboard as her eyes bulged briefly, her entire body swaying with the whip. The guard swung back and let the metal spikes sail again. The whip wrapped about her body, metal spikes digging hard into her stomach. She let out a gut-wrenching scream as the spikes tore into her abdomen, coming away with flesh and blood. Again and again, the guard relentlessly brutalized her body, and she screamed from the torture. At one point, her knees gave way, and she hung from her arms. She spewed vomit and choked, and still, the guard kept swinging. Daren screamed, emotions he had welled up for most of his life springing to life. He had never felt much for anything or anyone. It was his safety net for sanity. But now, understanding more who Alicia was, rage burned through him. He wanted to kill every last person who laughed at this brutalization. For 15 minutes, the guardsman's whip slammed against naked flesh, and the whip pulled back each time, blood dripping and spattering the floorboards. There was a strange inhuman gleam in the man's lustful eyes. He lived for this. Alicia's body oozed blood from every part. Her hair was matted and crusted. She had stopped screaming, as her voice was probably gone by now. Her body simply swung with each crack of the whip, dripping blood to land in a large pool beneath her. The crowd screamed on, bloodlust in their eyes. They didn't care she wasn't responding. Their minds were that of savage beasts in human form. They lived for killing, for the pain of others. Their minds were depraved of morals of any kind. Hot tears welled up, and he felt his insides burn hot, almost unbearable. The world was truly evil. He screamed and screamed, his heart broken. He heard the swordsman laugh beside him, his eyes fixated and tongue licking like a snake. Images of his parents flashed in his mind again. He couldn't stop them from coming, and his mind screamed. Where was this God they claimed was love? Why didn't he spare those in pain? Where was he now? Where are you? Daren screamed in sigh, anger at everything he saw around him. Why won't you save anyone? I believed in you once. But there's so much death, so much suffering, so much hate. Is she not worthy of saving? If not, you're heartless. Tears freely fell now, and he sobbed uncontrollably. He tried looking away, but at each strike of the guard's whip, his gut tightened, and all he saw was red. He had only wanted to help someone in need. Now he had to watch her scream and wither away in the most horrifying death. In a whispered choke between tears, he said, "Please, alien, answer me, save her." The swordsman was at his side instantly. The glare he held burned terror like nothing Daren felt before. "You whisper prayers to a dead god," he hissed vehemently. A knife flashed in his hand and jerked his head back hard till his neck was turned up. With glowing yellow eyes filled with hate, the swordsman grated, "Die, human." He lifted the blade. Images of mother and father flashed before Daren's eyes. With Alicia's body swaying lifeless in dark red blood, she was etched in his brain alongside his parents. With his last breath, he whispered, "Father, save her." The swordsman screamed and swung. A blinding wave of white and yellow flashed inside Daren's head. And time stopped. He stood on the bank of a strangely familiar lake. A forest of ancient maple and oak trees loomed overhead with massive trunks, and in the distance, a waterfall was heard. Turning to survey his surroundings, Daren started, eyes going wide in shock, and stepped back. From the trees, a glowing face stared back. But the face, it was inhuman. It was beyond anything he could comprehend. Eyes glowed from every part of a circular form within a strange wheel that spun. Faces of different creatures appeared one after the other in a frightening light silhouetted by a dense white fog. Each face of the bizarre creature took turns looking at him. From behind the strange creature, two figures stepped forward. Covered from head to feet, massive wings covered their heads and bodies. Nothing was revealed beneath as they approached. When they were between the strange multi-eyed creature and Daren, the wings covering the heads parted, revealing somewhat triangular faces with golden hair that flowed down over their shoulders. In the hands of one, a golden sword burned with flames that licked the blade, having no source. The other strange being held a rolled-up scroll it proceeded to unravel. From a distant place a voice echoed. "Daren Cole, son of Christopher Cole, of the House of Cole." The two winged creatures bowed slightly, and the voice continued. "Your cries to Elian have been heard, and your faith, though weak, has moved him with compassion." The first winged creature stepped forward and, stretching a hand out, said, "By decree of the Watchers, your memories are to be restored in hopes that you will find your way home." Saying this, the figure touched Daren's forehead, and a blinding light flashed before him. His eyes snapped open even as the blade fell. In an explosion of euphoric energy, the swordsman was thrown backward, his eyes rising in shock. The energy coursed through his veins like molten lava, having been growing for some time now. Without warning or even knowing how, he lifted his eyes to the sky, letting out a deafening scream. All the pent-up rage of what he had seen burst a dam inside. The tremors began first. From one end of the Colosseum to the other, spectators quieted, feeling the unnatural, unsettling shaking. Then from within, the molten lava of energy surged as one. White light shot heavenward on down through the ground with a deafening crack. In every direction, the sound of gears screeching echoed to a sudden panic scream from everywhere. Fire burst up from the sand in giant violent cracks spreading outward. Smoke billowed upwards and violent tremors shook the foundations of the city. Buildings and walls began cracking, crumbling under the strain of the quakes. Daren felt fire from within surging and turned to face the swordsman with heated vengeance. Seeing there was nobody there, he focused his gaze in front of him. The guardsman had stopped what he was doing and stood in shock at what he was seeing around him. He saw Daren's gaze fix on him and turned to flee. He was halfway across the stage when a tentacle of fire spread out like a fire whip. It wrapped about the man's waist, and he screamed out in agonizing pain. His flesh sizzled and burned at the touch. Daren, eyes burning with rage, yanked, and the guardsman's torso separated in half, his entrails spilling out over the stage in burning fire. His eyes bulged as blood pooled out his mouth with his last remaining seconds. Daren ran forward, forcing his entire being to be steel and not break. Approaching Alicia, he still quaked inside. She hung from the ropes, blood covering every inch of her body. With tears, he touched the rope binding her and they burned to ash. He had no idea how he did it. Nothing he was doing right now made sense. The ground shook violently again and something from beneath exploded. The stage shook violently, and the entire horizon tilted slightly to more deafening screams. Smoke filled the air, casting the world in a dark haze. Leaping forward, he caught Alicia before she fell to the ground. The gashes in her skin were deep and blood dribbled in tiny streams. All about him, the ground swayed back and forth. Smoke billowed now from crevices and holes within the sand, with tongues of flame increasing every second. Any minute now, the whole sky city was going to fall out of the sky. Above, airships filled the sky as people fled in droves. Grabbing hold of Alicia, he gripped her in his arms and made his way off the stage. He stopped only for a second, gazing into the sky, calculating which way the airships were flying out. Making his way as fast he could, he ran out of the Colosseum on down an alley. He hardly stopped to rest. The burden of carrying Alicia was extra tough as blood covered him, his hands becoming slick. He prayed fervently as he made his way around another block. Directly ahead, large metal doors opened to a large plateau of docking ramps and stairs leading from one level to the next of parked airships. Many were burning from explosions that burst out of the hull of the islands. Already a good portion of the city was in flames, reaching the edge, spreading out over to the docked ships. Reaching the stairs, Daren gripped Alicia tight and ascended. A loud squeal echoed everywhere and he braced himself against the stairwell. His heart pounded hard in his chest. The floor below gave a violent shake, and enormous cracks opened in every direction. Screams echoed as people fell into the abyss of fire beneath one after another. All there was now was to go up. The sky began tilting again with smoke billowing everywhere. From below, a deep rumble built with the sound of a furnace. Another 10 seconds and from every direction, brilliant blue light exploded violently as pipes and gears collapsed and buildings toppled and crumbled in a giant wave of deafening sounds. Daren yelled out, straining to keep his footing till at last he was on level ground, or as level as it could be. The horizon tilted fairly steeply to one side with gray clouds of smoke blocking the sun. Stumbling to keep his balance and hold Alicia at the same time, he dodged flying debris of burning ships with hulls collapsing in spectacular balls of flame. Directly ahead, a mid-sized airship was still tethered, though its docking clamps were about ready to burst. Leaping onto the docking ramp, he held Alicia to his chest and ran. Explosion after explosion echoed as airships built with a Sinvan engine burst violently, debris becoming missiles. One hit him across the back, and he stumbled, almost losing Alicia over the edge. He yelled out, holding her tight, fingers digging into her gaping sides. He fought on, stumbling hard till at last he climbed onto the deck of the ship. He immediately lowered Alicia to the floor and raced hard to a flight of stairs and down to the engine room. Steam was already pouring out of pipes that had been ruptured. Gripping several valve handles, he closed the fuel intakes before reading the gauges. He breathed a sigh of relief. The engine wasn't as damaged as he thought. Now came the tricky part. He had to detach from the dock without rupturing the hull or engine. That required a key he didn't have. Running up the stairs again, he entered the captain's bridge, reading the dials and gears. "Second generation," he whispered aloud. "You don't have the secondary locks." He roamed through the console station till he found the levers he wanted. A violent shake shook the bridge, and he fell backwards against a chair. Getting up, he grabbed the lever and looked through the window. From above, a large cannon swerved. He adjusted the lever some more till the cannon faced the docking clamps. "Sorry, girl," Daren whispered and punched a button. The cannon fired, and the landing dock clamps exploded in a shower of screeching heated metal. With the clamps detached, the ship lurched hard for several seconds before stabilizing. Daren let out a long sigh of relief and punched a few more buttons. He waited and listened for the secondary motors to come online. When they did, he started the mixing chambers that turned Sinvin into a powerful engine fuel. A few seconds later, the giant blades on top and back began whirling. One last press of a button and thrusters began to whine, gaining power. He watched out the back window as fire burst outwards with intense heat. He gave another sigh before turning his attention to his surroundings. He pushed a second lever, and the airship lurched softly before the sky city began slowly moving away. He ascended higher and higher. At the window, he stared with anger. He flipped the bird and said in a cold voice, "I won't miss you." He was about to turn when a deafening screaming roar echoed. The sky city and all her islands slowly tilted more till in a ball of flame, ascended for several seconds. 15 seconds later, a ball of white and blue flames lit the world below in a violent explosion of white light. Reverberating booms shook the airship violently, and it tilted in the sky hard. Daren gave everything he had to right the ship from the onslaught of sonic waves and explosion. He steered the ship into the foray of onslaught of waves, till slowly it died out, leaving him shaking. He felt he had dodged death a second time today. He could see below an enormous mushroom cloud billowing. He looked on, but without feeling, without emotions at all. What was there to feel? The place he had lived was a vile, depraved place of death. Returning to the main console, he raised one of the main levers, and again the ship ascended higher. He kept the ascent even as the air about him grew thin. As the first wisps of clouds engulfed the ship, he slowed the ascent before the deck was completely covered in fog. Locking the levers in place to hover, he leaped out from behind the consoles and back to the deck. Hesitating before Alicia's still body, he took her in his arms and raced down a flight of stairs. A corridor led to several rooms. He entered the first and laid her gently on the bed. He hadn't moved since he had grabbed her from the Colosseum. He stood there, heart pounding hard. He didn't want to know. In a matter of days, she had upended his entire world, but with it was a catalyst for breaking him out of his shell he lived in for decades. He looking down, fighting the waves of pain from seeing the results of her brutal torture. Slowly, he lowered his head and listened to her chest. In the silence, her heart thumped but barely. She took in shallow breaths of air, barely enough to keep alive. Standing straight again, he took in several breaths, feeling his insides scream again. He was so far out of his field here. He knew next to nothing about medicines, healing, anything of that nature. She needed a doctor, but, that wasn't happening anytime soon. He looked out a small window. They were all dead, all burned to ashes inside a Sinvin explosion. He fought back the urge to dwell on any of that. Hesitantly, he looked back at her, choking back bile. It was hard to tell with so much blood caking her body, but several of the wounds had deep gashes going through the skin to her bones. The savage beating had to have broken several ribs or more, and most likely, she was bleeding internally. She couldn't survive for much longer without proper knowledge, if that could even help. He doubted it. Blinking back tears, he knelt beside Alicia and whispered, "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for the evil in your life, for not being able to protect you." He closed his eyes and clasped her bloody hands in his own. He felt part of himself breaking away, the walls he had built so easily melting before her. A soft moan brought him up short, and he leaned in, clasping her hands a little more tightly. Her eyes were still closed tightly in pain, but there was movement behind her eyelids. Her fingers suddenly gripped his own, and she gave a soft intake of a struggled gasp. In a bare whisper between dripping blood from her mouth, she choked, "Help me." Through a choked voice, he replied sorrowfully, "I would give you anything if I could." Silence followed, and his heart skipped. He hated so much now the world he was in, the amount of evil. Something pricked hard against his hands, and he quickly looked down. From her neck, the strange necklace she had never bothered to tell him about, gave off a faint glow. Ever since they had encountered the swordsman, it hadn't glowed once. Now, it acted as if it were struggling. From his hands, then up the length of his arms and through his whole body he tingled. A strange sensation of floating, and he felt himself grow suddenly weak. An invisible wind washed over him, and he could only come up with one idea. He was being drained. Looking on Alicia, he held onto her hands, willing whatever she was doing to continue. "Take me," he whispered and closed his eyes. The sensation lasted for several minutes, and he could feel himself grow dizzy. He was losing strength. But it didn't matter. He didn't care. There was nobody in the world that mattered except Alicia right now. He let her keep doing whatever it was she was doing. A sudden gasp ripped from her cracked lips, and she cried out loud, bloody tears dripping from her eyes. Her body tightened and spasmed with violent shakes. She sobbed uncontrollably, screaming in pain. And then, all went silent, her body going limp. "Alicia!" Daren yelled, fear ripping through him. He leaned over quickly and listened intently. In a slow, steady motion, her chest lifted slightly and lowered, this time stronger than before. Her heart thumped louder and stronger. In a startling revelation, he also saw pink skin appearing where gaping holes had been seconds ago. She was still alive.